What do you think that would be like? Would it be any different from meeting a brother or sister from another congregation today? I don't know. What do you think? They talk differently, or
device?
I'm sorry?
What's audio device?
Audio?
Audio device.
That's what you want.
That's what
Needs help.
that's what helps you to hear us.
Okay.
Okay, you can hear us, Darlena?
Yeah, it just.
Okay. We were just talking about what it might be like to meet a member of the first century church, and what they might talk about, what they might dwell upon. I was thinking, the common salvation that we have in Jesus Christ would be very meaningful to someone who had seen the apostles and perhaps seen Jesus and heard Jesus, but then had been convicted of the sin or the crime of putting to death not just someone, but the Son of God. Imagine if you're convicted of that, and then you're told, but there's forgiveness. God himself, you've put to death his Son, but he offers you forgiveness. I think that would be something that would be uppermost in your mind. And the New Testament teaches that, in a sense, when we sin, we need the blood of Christ. In a sense, we crucify him again. But I just think it would be a meaningful thing for someone who has been there and perhaps saying, crucify him, and then finding a message of forgiveness. That means there's hope for me, maybe you feel the same way. So that would be something that would be very encouraging to us, to realize that there's forgiveness. And later on, the Apostle Paul, forgiveness for one who tried to destroy the church. I don't know if we'll get to that this week, but that's part of the message that's coming up. Anyway, so things seem to be going pretty well, and they've solved the internal problems of the church of ministering to the Grecian widows. And Stephen, one of the 7 appointed for that work, is also involved in preaching. And so in verse 8 of Acts chapter 6, now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, did great wonders and miraculous signs among the people. Opposition arose, however, from members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the provinces of Cilicia and Asia. These men began to argue with Stephen, but they could not stand up against his wisdom or the Spirit by whom he spoke. Here's one of those references, as we find frequently, to the Spirit. He's a man full of God's grace and power. We'll read later, he's full of the Spirit. And I don't know, why do you suppose these folks would oppose Stephen? These synagogue of the freedmen, people who've been slaves and made free, Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, where are those places?
Is that Alexandria in Egypt?
Egypt?
Alexandria is Egypt. Yeah, Cyrene is further west in North Africa. So these are people from North Africa. And then provinces of Cilicia and Asia, those are what is modern day Turkey. and we look upon them as a Muslim nation, but there was a tremendous Greek influence in Turkey, even well into the 20th century. If you want to learn more about that, look up some of the history of a New Testament town named Smyrna, which was in the news about 100 years ago. But anyway.
Are these people now living in Jerusalem?
Evidently they're there, yeah. I don't know if they're living there or they're just coming in for a feast and causing trouble. I don't know why they're opposing the church. Perhaps these are members of the Jewish diaspora, the disbursement of the Jews throughout the world, and they've kind of come under the influence of, irreligious folks. I don't know. That's about all I could think. We don't know why that particular opposition arose, but it did, and that we've experienced that in the prior persecution. It's the Sadducees party which has come to terms with the Roman occupation and the Greek philosophical influence in the world that's opposing the preachers who talk about resurrection from the dead and sin and its consequences and forgiveness. Vehement opposition motivated by Satan ultimately. But anyway, they argue, but they could not stand up against him. And I don't know what they said. It'd be interesting to know, did they say, that's crazy talking about resurrection from the dead? Or did they say that's crazy talking about sin and its consequences? I don't know what part of the preaching particularly trod on them. Maybe it was just the belief in God, an allegiance to God that causes such vehement opposition. And it still does if people want your allegiance rather than God. So if we have allegiance to God, it's going to offend some people and they get pretty excited about it. Anyway, what they do, they secretly persuaded some men to say, we have heard Stephen speak words of blasphemy against Moses and against God. Well, here they're using their religion as a means of accusing Stephen. Now that sounds like the accusations against who?
Against Jesus.
Jesus himself was accused of blasphemy against the law and against God, who was his father. So they stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law. So remember, in other persecutions, they have run up against the people and they've been afraid of the people. They've been afraid to act against the apostles, but here the people are stirred up and to oppose the church. And maybe we see behind this the influence not just of the Sadducees, or not primarily the Sadducees in this instance, but perhaps the Pharisees, who may have had more influence among the people as representing some kind of opposition to the Grecian influence and the compromise with the world, if you will. Anyway, they produced false witnesses who testified. Again, it sounds like we're reading about the trial of Jesus again with false witnesses, but in that case, they couldn't agree. This fellow never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us. And remember, Jesus was the one, they accused him, he was going to destroy the temple. He was talking about the temple of his body that would be put to death, but they accused him of that crime. in Matthew, we read about it, chapter 26. So all who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. I wonder, how did they know? Did you ever see anybody whose face was like the face of an angel? How would you know? Did it glow? Did it shine like the face of Moses when he'd been in the presence of God on Mount Sinai, such that he had to put a veil over his face?
I told Kathy that the first time I met her, but I don't think it was the same thing.
You had the face of an angel, yeah. There's a lot of songs about that too. Anyway.
I always thought it was strange though that they said he had a face like an angel, but all the descriptions of angels are terrifying. You know, it's so it is a little. I wonder if it was meant to say he was, you know, the light with which he shone terrified the people he was speaking to, because every account of an angel appearing before someone typically leads to people falling on their knees and covering their faces.
Yeah. Now, some have seen angels. We know the apostles have seen angels. I don't know if any of the men of the Sanhedrin have seen angels. We get the impression from the way that they're described in the New Testament as the bad guys, that maybe they haven't had too much contact with the godly influence of angels. But anyway, so he's recognized, and he's given the chance to answer. The high priest asked him, "Are these charges true?" And so he takes about 53 verses in his response, and his response is more like a sermon than a defense to a criminal charge. You know, because he wanders around as if he doesn't really want to get to things. But we'll see that just when he reaches the crisis point of his defense or his sermon, then something happens. But it's an interesting way to approach your defense. And that would be the question that we might ask. Why does he take the approach of a 50-verse recitation of Jewish history or Israelite history? Why is that his defense? Is it a defense? You'd think that a man on trial for what could be his life, maybe we would have approached it a little bit differently.
It's more of a prosecution of the nation of Israel.
Yeah, okay.
He's speaking more like the prosecutor than the defendant in this.
Yeah.
Especially if you take in consideration the history of Israel. I mean, he's giving a breakdown of the history of Israel. The history of Israel is a nation that continuously rejects the messengers of God.
Okay. That's his point, isn't it? He's ultimately going to build that case, and that the what was done to Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, is just consistent with what they've been doing all along. And God has been merciful, but that's the story. So are the charges against Stephen true?
Oh, they're trumped up.
Yeah. He doesn't
It's like
really.
the charges against Jesus, the same thing.
Okay, yeah. He
I don't
doesn't.
know that they're entirely trumped up. He pretty much confirms their charges well enough for them. I mean, he definitely does. I mean, if you read his sermon or whatever it is, basically says temple was a wrong turn. Temple was a blind alley. And that's quite a statement to make when you've been accused of speaking against the temple.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting, one of the charges, he's going to change the customs that Moses handed down to us. Not necessarily change the law, but change the customs. And that's a difficult thing to bear, isn't it? Somebody wants to change our customs. We don't want that. We don't want to hear too much about that, as they didn't. But it's interesting, in his discussion of the history of Israel, we learn some things that we may not have known from just reading the Old Testament. He starts out, brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. Leave your country and your people, God said, and go to the land I will show you. If you go to Genesis in chapter 11, it kind of suggests that Abraham's father was the one that led the clan from Ur of the Chaldees up to Haran in Padan Aram, or in the northern part of what we call the Fertile Crescent, and that God appeared to Abraham there, and then he moved from Haran over to Canaan. But here it makes it clear that Abraham was contacted, or Abram, as he was then known, was contacted in Ur. And there's some references in the Old Testament, kind of oblique to that, but here it's made clear. But the point was to Abram, what? Leave your country and your people and go to the land I will show you. Get away from your family. In a sense, I can only work with you if you get away from the influence of your family. And Joshua talks about they worshiped other gods. So sometimes that's the way that God works. He leads us someplace odd, and because he has something for us to do that we can't do in another context. So anyway, that's kind of, so he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran after the death of his father Terah in Haran. God sent him to this land where you are now living. He gave him no inheritance here, not even of a foot of ground. And we've talked about that, haven't we? That Abraham was living in the tents, was a sojourner in the land that was promised to him, but later. So, no inheritance. What else? God promised him that he and his descendants after him would possess the land, even though at that time Abraham had no child. God spoke to him in this way: your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, God said. And afterward, they will come out of that country and worship me in this place. So that's a reference to what?
To the
Exodus.
Hebrews
Exodus.
people being, after they came and settled there when Joseph was alive, and then
Okay.
became slaves of the Egyptians for a long time, and then later Moses came and led them out to freedom.
Okay. So that it's talking about Egyptian slavery, and that's been, trying to identify exactly what the 400 years was. The 400 years all in Egypt. I've seen some people who think the 400 years included Abraham's sojourn in Canaan, but we won't go into that. But the point is that they were enslaved and then came out, and God led them out of slavery, and they worshiped. But he punished the nation they served as slaves. Then he gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision. So they take great pride in that covenant. It came before the law of Moses. And so he's moving along quickly here. He gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision, and Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him 8 days after his birth. Later, Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob became the father of the 12 patriarchs. And because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt, but God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So he made him ruler over Egypt and all his palace. So we're getting a little bit of a hint of what the message is going to be as he talks about Joseph. And he's compressed several chapters of Genesis into just a couple of verses. But what's the point there in the context of what his major point is? And maybe we're looking forward too much.
Well, I think it's helpful to see all of this happens before there is an Israel, before there are Israelites. All of this happens to, as they say in the Passover Seder, a wandering Aramaean and his descendants, before they own any land in the promised land that Israel is so concerned about revering, before there's even thought of a temple, or all of this happens, including circumcision. All of it happens before there is a nation of Israel, and before there's a holy land, and before there's a temple. And God is at work. His point seems to be God has been at work in our people long before we were a people, and long before there was a temple.
So in the case of Joseph, God is at work. Joseph, we've seen in our studies of Genesis, in a sense, is a type of Christ. And his point, I think he's going to make it here. What did they do? Joseph was the person that was set for their redemption, but they sold him into slavery. And he got into all kinds of trouble. So here's a person who's the savior, but he suffers persecution. So that's kind of example number one. And he's going to go on and follow up that example with others. So, the Sanhedrin would pride itself on being, we're of the Josephite, but Stephen is going to make, no, you're the spiritual descendants of those who sold the Redeemer, if you will, into slavery. And that's the point he's going to make later. But anyway, so yeah.
Bad guys.
What's that?
The bad guys. He's
Right. That's where he's going. That's where he's going.
That's why I don't like it. They're going to stone him.
Yeah. And now his next example after Joseph, he spends some time on, we'll get to that, but then a famine struck all ages. So he brings the situation forward and bring great suffering. Our fathers could not find food, the sons of Israel. When Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers on their first visit. On the second visit, Joseph told his brothers who he was, and Pharaoh learned about Joseph's family. After this, Joseph sent for his father Jacob and his whole family, 75 in all, depending on how you count. But then Jacob went down to Egypt, where he and our fathers died. Their bodies were brought back to Shechem and placed in the tomb that Abraham had bought from the sons of Hamor at Shechem for a certain sum of money. Now, really, we could go into that. Did they mean Jacob and so on? But we learned that we didn't learn where the 12 sons of Israel were buried until here, or where they were interred. But well, we'll just keep going and not go into that. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. Then another king who knew nothing about Joseph became ruler of Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. And that begins the story of who? Moses. And so if we look upon Joseph as a agent of God to redeem his people, surely Moses fits that description. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months, he was cared for in his father's house. We've made the little boat, put him in the bulrushes, and with the flannel graph shows that he's rescued by Pharaoh's daughter and so on. Brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was, and this emphasizes, even though he's brought up in the royal palace, he continues to identify with his own people, called Hebrews. And he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. And that's all in the Old Testament. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. So that's an interesting slant on it, that 25th verse of the thought of Moses when he was 40 years old. We don't read about that in the Old Testament. Stephen tells us about what Moses was thinking when he was age 40 and killed the Egyptian. How does he know? He had a conversation with Moses. Well, Moses, what were you thinking then? Somehow it's been revealed to him, or maybe there is some information that was transmitted down through the centuries, separate and apart from the Torah, which we have. But it's an interesting insight into the mind of Moses, that at that point, he thought maybe there would be an uprising and a rebellion against Egyptian rulership. But there's not. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him. And maybe that's part of the problem. He was thinking a little too much of himself. You know, he's ready for the glory of leading the revolution. But God says, no, Moses, not yet. Not yet. You've got 40 years of training to undergo before I use you for that purpose. Had God somehow spoken to him that he was to be a leader?
Yeah.
Moses thought somehow. But
The
anyway,
bottom line, Alan, I'd say he ran ahead of God
okay.
at that point. And other people in the Bible have done that too. And we can make the same mistake. It's a tricky thing to know God's timing, but
Yeah.
that's what happened there. I think he did something rash ahead of time, God's time.
Sometimes and maybe that's the point, that if we're act on our own schedule, we tend to say, I did it. But when we act on God's schedule, we've learned it's God who's doing it. And we could talk a lot about the mind of Moses, but it's interesting that Stephen has that insight into Moses that we don't get in Genesis or in Exodus. So he goes on. The next day, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. So he gets out of town because he understands that this, what has been done to the Egyptian, is known. Was he afraid? Anyway, I asked, go ahead.
I would suppose he was afraid that if these Israelites knew, then the Egyptians knew, and he would be punished.
Yeah. And I'd say that because of a couple of verses. In Exodus chapter 2, we're told, then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. And when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled. Now, in another comment on that comes from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 27, where we're told, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. So anyway, in describing Moses as a man of faith. And so there was some fear initially, but in Hebrews, it suggests that matured into something more than faith, or something different than fear, I'm sorry. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. So anyway, maybe he sat down and thought and came to the conclusion, this may be part of the plan of God, or this is the plan of God. And I don't know if we ever do that, if maybe we have something that we fear in life, and then some way we sit back and say, God is aware that I'm going through this. Maybe this is part of the plan of God, that somehow when I get through with this, or when it gets through with me, I'll be a more effective person in the kingdom of God. I don't know. Those are just some thought. Again, we get some insights into the mind of Moses from Stephen, and some challenges to our way of thinking that you wouldn't get just reading the Old Testament. That's what makes this speech so interesting to me. Anyway, fear, but he begins to realize, well, maybe God has something for me to do. So he goes into the Sinai desert, the land of Midian, and then, as kind of in the Old Testament, and Stephen goes on and says, after 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of the burning bush. And we've heard about that in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to look more closely, he heard the Lord's voice. I am the Lord of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Remember, he had to take off his shoes because he was on holy ground. Don't know if he's had any revelation from God. He's been living as a shepherd there, attending the flocks of this fellow named Jethro or Ruel, whatever, or Hobab, however you want to name him. But just, he gets married, has a couple of kids. Finally, 40 years later, God has this to say to him. And, has he given up? We don't know. Sometimes God's timing is difficult. Then the Lord said to him, "Take off your sandals. The place where you're standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt." And Moses, who, me? But he's, at age 40, he seems he's ready to lead the revolution. At age 80, wait a minute, God sent somebody else. But God can use him at age 80, but for some reason, not at age 40. So this is the same Moses, and that's again, Moses is a deliverer. What's going to happen to him when he comes with the message of deliverance? And then Stephen is going to say, the prophet like unto Moses comes. What happens to him? 22. This is the same Moses whom they had rejected with the words, "You who made you ruler and judge." Kind of an interesting slant on it. He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and did wonders and miraculous signs in Egypt at the Red Sea and for 40 years in the desert. That verse 35, they rejected Moses. Maybe these are just little insights from Stephen's description of it. Maybe the Lord wasn't ready to work with Moses at age 40. He needed more maturity or training. Maybe it was because the people weren't ready at that point in time. Of course, they weren't thrilled about it later on. But anyway, he led them out of Egypt. Just, is this a different tradition, or is Stephen, as a preacher, kind of drawing some substance? Anyway, it seems like he's read a commentary. He's read a commentary on Genesis or knows some things. Anyway, this is what Moses told the Israelites: God will send you a prophet like me from your own people. And that's a prophecy from Deuteronomy that there would be another prophet. And of course, that is Jesus, who's the prophet like unto Moses. At the end of the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 34, and at that time, no prophet like Moses had arisen. But in the New Testament, we will read about that. So here's another Redeemer that was, Stephen's making the point, he was mistreated by the people. They have a history of this. Our fathers refused to obey him. Instead, they rejected him and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. Remember, they complained about everything. Oh, it was better in Egypt, even though they were under persecution. They told Aaron, and this is when Moses was up on the mount to receive the law, the people, and we read, tell Aaron, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. He's been up on the mountain quite a while. That was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it and held a celebration in honor of what their hands had made. And we know Moses, broke the tablets and came down and melted the golden calf and mixed it with their water supply, and they had to drink it. But anyway, God turned away and gave them over to the worship of the heavenly bodies. This agrees with what is written in the book of the prophets. Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the desert, O house of Israel? You have lifted up the shrine of Moloch and the star of your god Rephan, idols. Moloch was the god which demanded human sacrifice. And therefore, I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. Here, Stephen uses a liberty because the original prophecy says, I will send you into exile beyond Damascus. This are some words from the prophet Amos in chapter 5 of Amos. But anyway, it's interesting that he jumps from the wandering in the wilderness to the time of Amos, which is a long time later. But we get the impression, did they, as they were offering sacrifices during the wilderness wanderings, it's a little unclear here. Does that mean they were at the same time continually tempted into idolatrous worship? Or is this exclusively referring to later times? Almost the suggestion is there that throughout the wilderness wanderings and even during their victorious occupation of Canaan, there was worship of God, but also they were, worshiping idols at the same time. At least in Stephen's compression of Jewish history, there's kind of that implication. So it's an interesting. Jeremiah is the one who talks about they worshipped the sun, the moon, and the stars, explicitly the heavenly bodies. So anyway, again, just a little slant on how Stephen puts all of this stuff together. Again, his point, though, the redeemers have come and have been mistreated, and that you're doing the same thing in the case of Christ. I've run out of time. I get so wound up in all of this that we'll talk more about history next time, but we'll get to the crux of the sermon. And he finally gets to it, and then he doesn't get to offer an invitation before he meets violence. So anyway, thank you for your attention to all of this. Here's Matt with a song.
We praise thee, O God, for the Son of our Lord, O Jesus, who died and is now gone above. Hallelujah, and the glory, hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, and the glory, and miracles, amen. We praise thee, O God, for the Spirit of God, who has shown us our Savior. Hallelujah, 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 and the glory of His. glory and praise and tenderness and charity. Hallelujah, hallelujah, all glory and praise to the God
of all grace,
who has
who has
brought us
brought
in
us
sorrows
and
and
guided
guided
our
our
way.
ways. Hallelujah, hallelujah,
Hallelujah, amen.
hallelujah,
Hallelujah, thine the glory, revive us again.
revive
Us
us
again.
each heart
Revive us. With fire from above. Hallelujah, thine the glory, hallelujah, amen.
Hallelujah, thine the glory, revive us
again.
Amen. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
God bless.
You guys have a good week.
Good week.
Do.
Bye.
Bye.
See you later.